Ambassador Thyra Valen noticed the empty chairs first. She had been sitting in the great circular hall of the Rathani Concord for nearly an hour, waiting for the human delegation to arrive, and they had never been late before. Not once in the 12 years she had served as senior diplomat to the Joint Council. The humans were many things, loud and stubborn and far too cheerful for a species that had only been among the stars for 600 years. But they were never late. She pressed the comm panel on her desk and opened a channel to the human embassy on Rathanos Prime. Nothing. Not static, not a busy signal, not an automated message telling her to try again later. Nothing at all. She tried again, this time on the emergency frequency that every species kept open at all times, the one channel that was never supposed to go dark under any circumstances. Silence. Thyra felt her secondary gills flutter, which only happened when she was genuinely afraid, and she stood from her chair and walked quickly down the long glass corridor that connected the council hall to the embassy district. The human embassy was sealed, every window dark, every door locked behind heavy blast shutters that she had never seen activated before. And when she pressed her hand to the entry scanner, it simply blinked red and offered no explanation. She contacted Rathani intelligence within the hour. By the end of that day, the reports started coming in, and each one was worse than the last. Every human colony had gone dark, all 47 of them spread across 3 galactic arms, and it had happened almost simultaneously, within a window of roughly 6 hours. Trade convoys that had been mid-route between human and alien worlds had stopped, powered down their engines, sealed their hulls, and gone completely silent. Human embassies on over 40 alien worlds had done exactly what Thyra had witnessed, shutting their doors. Doors and activating blackout protocols without a single word of warning or explanation. Long-range scans of the Sol system, the ancient home of humanity, showed that Earth and its surrounding stations were still powered and still populated, but they were wrapped in some kind of energy barrier that no one had ever seen before, something that shimmered faintly and reflected every probe and scan sent toward it. The humans had not been destroyed. They had not fled. They were still there, behind walls of light, and they simply were not answering. The galaxy noticed, slowly at first, and then all at once. The Torvan Dominion, whose reptilian warriors had fought beside and against humans for centuries, dismissed it within the first week, their war council issuing a short statement that roughly translated to, "The mammals are probably having another one of their elections, and returning to their border patrols." The Aelith Communion, the vast hive mind that stretched across 1,000 worlds, and thought with 1 billion linked brains, registered the silence as a statistical anomaly, and assigned a monitoring subnode to track it, giving it roughly the same priority as a minor trade disruption. The Valkyr sovereignty, whose silicon-based minds processed reality through pure mathematics, began running probability models, but shared nothing with anyone, because the Valkyr never shared anything until they were certain. The Dramari Pact panicked first. The Dramari were traders, merchants, wanderers, a species of hollow-boned avians who had built their entire civilization on the movement of goods between stars, and humans were their single largest trade partner, responsible for nearly 1/3 of all Dramari commerce. Within 2 weeks of the silence, 6 Dramari colony worlds issued famine warnings, because the human agricultural shipments they depended on had simply stopped coming. Flock Speaker Parisha, the elected voice of the Dramari people, sent a desperate message to every major power in the galaxy, asking if anyone knew what had happened to the humans. No one answered with anything useful. Thyra watched all of this from her office on Rathanos Prime, and she felt a growing weight in her chest that she could not explain through simple politics. She had known humans for a long time, had studied their history and their culture, and their maddening habit of inserting themselves into every crisis, whether they were invited or not. and she had come to understand something about them that most alien species overlooked. Humans were loud. Not just in the obvious way, not just their music and their arguments and their inability to whisper in a library, but in a deeper way, a fundamental way. They radiated connection, the way a star radiated light. Constantly reaching out, constantly broadcasting, constantly looking for someone to talk to, or trade with, or argue with, or help. 600 years of spacefaring civilization, and humanity had never once gone a single day without reaching out to someone. And now, they had been silent for weeks. That was not politics. That was not an election or a civil war or a diplomatic strategy. That was something wrong on a level that Thyra could feel in her bones. She began making calls, pulling in favors she had saved for decades, reaching out to contacts in every empire and territory. And slowly she began to piece together the last communications anyone had received from human space before the silence fell. Most of it was ordinary, trade confirmations and weather reports, and a surprisingly detailed argument between two human scientists about whether a certain type of cheese could technically be classified as a mineral. But buried in the static of the final hours, Rithani intelligence found something else. A fragment, broken and garbled, clearly not meant for alien ears, had slipped through the barriers before they fully closed. The decryption team worked on it for 3 days, and managed to pull only 3 words from the noise. They found us. Thyra read those words on her screen, and sat very still for a very long time. Then she opened a channel to the leaders of every major galactic power and requested an emergency summit. Because those 3 words changed everything. They meant the humans had not chosen silence. Something had forced it upon them. And whatever that something was, it was already inside human space, already wrapped around their worlds, already pressing down on a species of 8 billion souls. Thyra did not know what had found humanity, but she knew, with a certainty that went deeper than logic, that if it could silence the loudest species in the galaxy, then none of them were safe. The emergency summit was scheduled for 1 week later. She hoped that would be fast. Enough. She was not at all sure it would be. 2 months after the silence began, the galaxy started to crack. It happened quietly at first, the way a frozen lake cracks, small lines spreading outward from a central point that nobody noticed until the whole surface was ready to collapse. The Torvan Dominion and the Rithani Concord nearly went to war over the Kellen Corridor, a narrow stretch of space between their territories that had been peaceful for 40 years. The only reason it had been peaceful was because a human mediator named James Chen had spent 6 years living on a space station between the 2 borders, patiently listening to both sides complain about each other, and somehow always finding a compromise before the guns came out. James Chen was gone now, locked behind whatever barrier had swallowed human space. And without him, the old arguments came back fast and hot. Piracy surged across the free trade lanes that humans had once patrolled. Not because humanity had the largest fleet, but because human captains had a reputation for showing up wherever trouble was, and stubbornly refusing to leave until it stopped. Without those patrols, the raiders grew bold, and the Dramari merchant fleet suffered worst of all, losing 11 cargo ships in a single month. Flock speaker Parisha stopped sleeping. She spent her nights reviewing supply reports from the 6 colony worlds that were running out of food, worlds that had built their economies around human trade because humans had always been there, always reliable, always willing to sell grain and medicine at prices that the Dramari could afford. Now the shelves were empty, and the children were hungry, and Parisha could not stop thinking about a human expression she had once heard, something about how you never know how much you depend on something until it is gone. She hated that the humans were right about that too. The emergency summit convened on neutral ground, a space station called the Pale. bridge that floated in unclaimed space between the 5 major empires. Ambassador Thyra Valon arrived first, and spent the waiting hours reviewing everything Rithani intelligence had gathered, which was not much. The energy barriers around human space resisted every form of scanning, and 2 unmanned probes sent into the barrier zone had simply vanished, without sending back any data at all. One thing was clear though, the barriers were not human technology. The energy signatures were wrong, too old, too strange, built on principles that did not match anything in human engineering databases. Something else had put those walls up, something that wanted humanity locked inside. Warlord Kreth Vasur of the Torvan Dominion arrived next, stomping into the summit chamber in full ceremonial armor, his scarred face locked in a permanent scowl that Torvan considered a polite expression. He had not wanted to come, had argued loudly in his own war council that the humans could take care of themselves, and that the Torvan had better things to do than chase after mammals who could not be bothered to answer their comms. But then his eldest daughter Kiva had visited him in his private quarters and reminded him of something he did not like to think about. 20 years ago, at the Battle of Okran Vale, Kreth had been badly wounded, a plasma burn that had melted through his chest armor and scorched his secondary heart. And he had been lying on the deck of a burning ship, waiting to die, when a human field medic, a small woman whose name he had never learned, had crawled through wreckage and fire to reach him, pumped him full of enough stimulants to wake a dead moon, and dragged him to an evac shuttle while enemy fire tore the corridor apart around them. He had never thanked her. He had never even learned her name. And now she might be trapped behind a wall of light on some human world, and Kreth Vasur found that this thought made him angrier than any battle ever had. The Aelith Prime node arrived as a holographic projection, a shimmering column of light that represented the collective will of 1 billion linked minds. And for the first time in recorded history, the projection flickered, because the Aelith were not fully in agreement. Some nodes wanted to investigate the human silence, arguing that whatever had silenced them could reach the communion next, while other nodes coldly suggested that the Aelith should simply annex the now undefended human trade routes and strengthen their own position. The argument raged through the hive mind at the speed of thought, 1 billion voices shouting at each other in perfect silence, until the Prime node overrode all dissent with a single command pulse that shook every Aelith in the galaxy. If what silenced the humans reaches us, the Prime node declared, there will be no trade routes left to annex. There will be no communion left to profit. There will be nothing but silence, and we are a species that thinks as one. Which means silence is our death. The debate ended. Calculus Prime 9 of the Valkyr sovereignty appeared as a crystalline construct, cold and geometric and utterly without emotion, and it presented its findings to the summit in the flat tonal register that the Valkyr used for everything from weather reports to declarations of war. The probability models were complete. In 94.7% of scenarios where a civilization went completely silent in this manner, the cause was an extinction-level threat. Not internal, not political, but external, something from outside that had come to consume. The Valkyr did not act from sentiment, Calculus Prime 9 explained. They did not understand sentiment, but they understood mathematics, and the mathematics were extremely clear. A galaxy without humanity is a galaxy 62.3% more likely to experience cascading civilizational collapse within the next 1,000 years, it said. Humans are a stabilizing variable. Remove them, and the equation fails. This is not opinion. This is arithmetic. Pirisha was the last to speak, and she did not bother with analysis or models or military calculations. She stood before the assembled powers, with her feathers trembling and her voice cracking, and she said what everyone in the room already knew, but no one else had been willing to say out loud. They fed our children when our harvests failed. They sent doctors to our plague worlds when no one else would come. They sat with us during the long morning, and helped us bury our dead, and now they are trapped behind walls we cannot see, and wrapped in a silence we cannot break. And if we sit here and do nothing, then we deserve whatever comes for us next." The chamber was quiet for a long time after that. Then Warlord Krethvasur stood up, all 7 feet of scaled muscle, ceremonial steel, and he looked at the Dramari flux speaker with an expression that might have been respect. "I will bring my fleet," he said. One by one they agreed. The Rithani would coordinate and communicate. The Torvan would fight. The Aelith would adapt and evolve tactics in real time. The Valkyr would analyze and engineer. The Dramari would supply and support. 5 empires that had never agreed on anything in the entire history of galactic civilization looked at each other across that summit table and decided together that the silence had gone on long enough. They called it the Galactic Compact, and for the first time in 600 years, the largest armada ever assembled set course not for conquest or defense, but for rescue. They were going to Sol. They were going to find out what had taken humanity's voice. And if it could be killed, they were going to kill it. The compact fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Sol system, and every single captain on every single ship went quiet at the same time. It was not a silence born of discipline or protocol. It was the silence of beings staring at something that should not exist. The human homeworld was still there, a blue and green jewel hanging in the black. But it was wrapped in a barrier of shifting light that pulsed like a slow heartbeat. And orbiting that barrier were things that no sensor could properly read. They were vast and dark, and they moved without engines or thrust, drifting through space like ink spreading through water. And wherever they passed, the stars behind them seemed to dim. Not blocked, but swallowed, as if the light simply chose not to exist in their presence. They did not register as ships. They did not register as life. They were holes in the shape of the universe, places where something had been removed. Nothing had been put back. The Valkyr were the first to speak. "Those are the source of the barriers," Calculus Prime 9 announced across the fleet-wide channel, its crystalline voice flat and calm. "They are not from our dimension. They exist partially outside normal space, and based on their energy signatures, they have been in this galaxy for approximately 11,000 years, dormant, waiting." "Waiting for what?" Warlord Kreth growled from the bridge of his flagship. "For something loud enough to wake them." Ambassador Thyra felt ice run through her veins. 11,000 years, that was older than every civilization in the Compact, older than the Rithani's first cities, older than the Aelith's first hive, older than memory itself. And humanity, loud, stubborn, impossible humanity, had been the thing that finally stirred them from their sleep. The Torvan War Council did not wait for a battle plan. They never did. A single command, and 40 Torvan dreadnoughts surged forward in a wedge formation, their engines burning white-hot, their weapon systems screaming to life, and every Torvan warrior on every ship opened their comms and roared, because the Torvan believed that the louder you screamed going into battle, the more likely your ancestors were to watch. The dreadnoughts hit the outer formation of dark entities, and the results were immediate and terrible. Energy weapons, the pride of Torvan engineering, passed through the entities like light through smoke. Plasma bolts that could crack a moon simply vanished into the darkness without effect. And kinetic rounds, massive tungsten slugs fired at a fraction of light speed, dissolved into nothing the moment they made contact. The entities did not fight back. They did not need to. The Torvan ships began to slow, their engines losing power, their weapons going quiet. And across the fleet channel, Thyra could hear the change in the Torvan voices, the battle roars fading, replaced by something she had never heard from that species before. Confusion, then doubt, then a creeping heavy silence that pressed down like a weight on every mind. The entities were doing what they did. They were smothering. They were pressing down on the connection between thinking beings, dampening the signals that linked mind to mind and heart to heart, and the Torvan, for all their strength, were social creatures underneath their armor, pack hunters who drew courage from their bonds with each other. Those bonds were being eaten. All Torvan vessels pulled back now, Thyra commanded across the fleet channel. But Kreth was already giving the order, his voice strained and rough, because even he could feel the weight of it, the terrible, creeping loneliness that seeped through the hull like cold through a cracked window. The Aelith moved next, and they moved differently. Not charge. They flowed. 1,000 smaller vessels spreading out in a pattern that shifted and adapted in real time. Each ship linked to the hive mind. Each crew an extension of a single vast intelligence. And the Aelith discovered something. When they synchronized their thoughts, when they pulsed their hive-mind connection in a specific rhythm, the dark entities flinched. It was barely visible, a slight shudder in their formless bodies, a momentary thinning of the darkness, but it was there. Synchronized cognition disrupts their structure, the Prime Node reported. They feed on isolation, on the breaking of connections, and we are a species that is never isolated. We are always one, we are always together, and that causes them pain. The Valkyr seized on this information instantly. Calculus Prime 9 ran 14,000 simulations in the time it took Thyra to blink. And then the Valkyr fleet deployed something new. Resonance weapons. Devices that had never been tested in combat. Designed to vibrate at frequencies that matched the dimensional anchors holding the entities in normal space. The weapons fired. And for the first time, the dark things screamed. It was not a sound exactly, more like a vibration that every living being in the fleet felt in their bones, a sensation of something ancient and vast, and deeply offended that anything had dared to hurt it. The barriers around Earth flickered. Cracks appeared in the shimmering light, thin lines of darkness that spread like veins across the surface of the barrier. And through those cracks, the fleet's sensors caught the first readings from the planet below. 8 billion life signs. Still alive. Still there. The Dramari moved then, and they did something that no one expected from a species of merchants and traders. Flock Speaker Parisha ordered her fleet, the smallest in the compact by far, to fly screening patterns between them. Larger warships and the dark entities, drawing attention, absorbing hits, buying time for the Valkyr resonance weapons to recharge. "We are merchants," she broadcast to her captains, her voice shaking but clear. "We are not warriors. We have never been warriors. But we are here because we owe a debt that cannot be measured in currency. And today, we pay it in the only coin that matters." Dramari ships burned and broke, and their crews died in the darkness between stars. Small, hollow-boned people who had never held a weapon in their lives, giving everything they had for a species that had once given everything for them. And then the Rithani did the most unexpected thing of all. Ambassador Thyra Velon had been thinking about the Aelith discovery, about how synchronized connection disrupted the entities, about how they fed on silence and isolation, and she had been thinking about what the opposite of silence was. She opened every cultural archive the Rithani had ever maintained. Every recording, every file, every piece of human culture that had been shared with the Rithani over 6 centuries of friendship. And she broadcast it all. Human music poured across the battlefield, symphonies and rock songs and lullabies and the terrible, wonderful noise of a species that had never once shut up. Human voices filled the void, recordings of speeches and arguments and jokes and bedtime stories told to children who were now grown. Human laughter, the most human sound of all, echoed through the fleet channels and bounced off the hulls of 1,000 alien ships. The dark entities recoiled. They twisted and writhed and pulled back from the sound like creatures of the deep retreating from light, because this was everything they hated, everything they had come to destroy, the raw, unfiltered noise of a species that defined itself by its connections to each other. The barriers cracked wider, and then, from deep within the fractures, came something that made every being in the fleet stop breathing. A signal, weak and broken and wrapped in static, but unmistakably human. It was not a cry for help. It was not a plea for rescue. It was a targeting solution, a precise mathematical map of every weak point in every dark entity surrounding Earth, calculated with the desperate precision of people who had been studying their enemy for 2 months from the inside. The humans had been fighting this whole time. They had been trapped and smothered and pressed down into silence. And they had kept fighting, kept thinking, kept working, and now they were giving their rescuers the keys to victory. Thyra stared at the data streaming across her screen and felt tears running down her face. Because of course the humans had not given up. Of course they had not surrendered. They were the loudest species in the galaxy, and no amount of darkness was ever going to change that. Forwarded the targeting data to every ship in the fleet. All vessels, she said, her voice steady despite the tears. The humans left the light on for us. Let us not waste it. The compact fleet opened fire with everything it had, and this time they did not miss. General Lean Morrow had not spoken a word out loud in 53 days. Not because she had nothing to say, she had plenty to say, most of it angry, but because the thing that had wrapped itself around Earth did not allow it. It had arrived without warning on a Tuesday afternoon, which Lean would later think was somehow the most offensive part of all. Not even a dramatic entrance, not even the courtesy of showing up on a significant date. Just a regular Tuesday, when she had been eating lunch in her office at Geneva Command, and the lights had flickered, and the comms had died, and the sky outside her window had turned a color that did not have a name. The first hour was confusion. Every communication device on the planet failed simultaneously. Not broken, not jammed, just emptied, as if the concept of transmitting a signal had been gently removed from reality. The second hour was panic. 8 billion people reached for their phones and their radios, their networks, and found nothing. And the silence that followed was the loudest thing Leon had ever heard, a roaring absence of sound that pressed against the inside of her skull like deep water pressure. By the end of the first day, Leon understood what they were dealing with, even if she could not yet name it. It was not an invasion in any way she recognized. Nothing had landed, nothing had attacked, no demands had been made, and no ultimatums delivered. Instead, something had simply settled over the Earth like a heavy blanket, something old and patient and vast, and it was pressing down on every connection between every human being on the planet. Speech became difficult first, words getting lost between the brain and the mouth, sentences fragmenting into confusion before they could be finished. Then electronic communication died completely. Every network, every satellite, every wire and cable and fiber optic line going dark, as if they had never existed. Then written words began to fade, ink on paper becoming blurry and hard to read, text on screens dissolving into meaningless shapes. It was eating their ability to connect. It was feeding on the silence it created, growing stronger with every broken connection, every failed conversation, every moment of isolation it forced upon a species that had built its entire civilization on the ability to reach each other. Governments collapse within days because governments require communication to function, and without communication, there was no chain of command, no coordination, no ability to organize a response to something that most people could not even see. Lean watched it happen from Geneva, watched the world go dark piece by piece, watched billions of people retreat into confusion and fear and a terrible crushing loneliness that was worse than any weapon she had ever faced. People gave up. That was the worst part, on them, and they simply stopped trying, stopped reaching out, stopped fighting, curling in on themselves like dying stars, and millions of them faded away, not from violence or hunger, but from a despair so deep and so complete that their bodies simply followed their spirits into the dark. Lian wanted to scream. She could not. So she did something else. On the fourth day of the silence, she walked out of Geneva Command and found a wall, and she scratched words into the concrete with a piece of broken rebar. "We are still here." The words stayed visible for almost an hour before the thing pressing down on them made the scratches blur and fade. But someone saw them before they vanished. A young lieutenant named Tomas Reyes, who had been wandering the empty halls of the command building with tears running down his face. And he found Lian, and grabbed her arm, and pointed at the wall, and she could see it in his eyes, the desperate burning need to not be alone. They could not speak. So Lian tapped his hand. 3 quick taps. The oldest and simplest code humanity had ever known. The same pattern a mother used to comfort a child. And Tomas tapped back. And that was the beginning of the resistance. It spread the way fire spreads through dry grass. Humans could not speak, so they tapped, they touched, they held hands and communicated through pressure and rhythm and the simple act of physical contact. When tapping was suppressed, they used sign language, and when sign language was blurred, they used facial expressions. And when even those became difficult, they simply sat together and refused to be apart. Because that was the one thing the silence could not take from them. It could eat their words and dissolve their writing and kill their technology, but it could not stop them from choosing to be near each other. It could not prevent a hand from reaching for another hand in the dark. It could not erase the fundamental human need to not be alone. Lian built her resistance on that foundation. She found scientists who communicated through chemical reactions, mixing compounds that changed color in patterns that carried meaning. A language of bubbling liquids and shifting hues that the silence could not suppress, because it had never encountered anything like it. She found engineers who built analog devices out of scrap, mechanical systems with no electronic components, things made of gears and levers and springs that clicked and clattered and carried messages through vibration, because the silence fed on electromagnetic signals, but could not digest sound that came from physical objects striking each other. She found soldiers who organized themselves through relay chains, lines of people stretching across kilometers, each one passing information through touch to the next. A human network made of flesh and bone, and stubborn refusal to surrender. It was slow and clumsy and primitive, and it was the most beautiful thing Lian had ever seen. She learned about the enemy through painful trial and observation. The silence had a name in old human records, files from centuries ago that were so deeply buried and so heavily encrypted that even the silence could not find and destroy them. They called it the Quiet. It was not a species, and it was not a machine, and it was not alive in any way that biology understood. It was something from outside, from the spaces between dimensions, a thing that existed in the gaps between connection, and fed on the energy that thinking beings generated when they reached for each other. It had been sleeping in the dark spaces of the galaxy for thousands of years, dormant and patient, and humanity's ever-expanding web of communication, 6 centuries of signals spreading outward at the speed of light, had finally reached it and woken it up. It had come for humanity first, because humanity was the one who came looking. Loudest meal it had ever sensed. Lian refused to be food. She organized her resistance around a single goal, not to fight the Quiet directly, because they could not hurt it, not to break the barriers, because they did not have the technology, but to build something that could reach through the walls and speak to whoever might be listening on the other side. They called it the Beacon. It took 40 days to build, 40 days of silent, coordinated labor by thousands of people who communicated through touch and chemistry and mechanical vibration, 40 days of scavenging and engineering, and assembling a planet-wide resonance array out of parts that should not have worked together, but did because the people building it refused to accept that they would not. The beacon could not send a message in any traditional sense, because the quiet would have intercepted and devoured any attempt at communication. So instead, Lian and her scientists designed it to send something else. Data. Pure mathematical data, a targeting solution, a map of every weak point and vulnerability in the quiet structure that they had identified during 2 months of study from the inside. They could not call for help, but if help came, they could tell it exactly where to strike. On the 53rd day of the silence, the barriers cracked. Lian was standing on the roof of Geneva Command, staring up at the shimmering wall of light that had hidden the sky for almost 2 months, and she saw the fractures spread like lightning across the barrier's surface, and through the cracks she saw stars. And then she heard something that nearly broke her. Voices. Alien voices pouring through the cracks. Torvan war horns rumbling like thunder. Aelith harmonic pulses singing in perfect synchronization. Dramari trade songs bright and fast and full of joy. Rithani diplomatic greetings, formal and warm. Valkyr data streams clicking in precise mathematical patterns. And underneath all of that, woven through every alien transmission, like a thread of gold through dark cloth, she heard human music, human laughter, human voices recorded across 6 centuries of civilization, being broadcast back at Earth by people who had never forgotten what humanity sounded like. Lian laughed. It was the first sound she had made in 53 days, and it tore out of her throat like something alive, raw and rough, and so full of relief that it hurt. And beside her, Tomas Reyes was laughing too, and across the city she could see people stumbling out of buildings, and looking up at the cracking sky, and opening their mouths, and remembering what their voices sounded like. She found a working comm unit, the first one that had functioned since the silence began, and she opened a channel to the alien fleet that she could now see through the fractures in the barrier, hundreds of ships burning bright against the black. "Long enough," she said, and her voice was a wreck, hoarse and broken, and the most beautiful sound she had ever heard herself make. We left the door open. Then she activated the beacon and sent everything they had. Every weak point, every vulnerability, every crack in the Quiet's armor that 53 days of desperate silent study had revealed. She gave the galaxy a weapon. And then she went to find her people, because there was still a war to fight, and humanity had been quiet long enough. The barrier fell at dawn. It came apart in great shimmering sheets of light that peeled away from the sky and dissolved into nothing, and for the first time in 53 days, the people of Earth saw open stars above their heads and the dark shapes of alien warships moving between them like guardian spirits made of steel. The compact fleet poured through the gaps, armed with the targeting data that humanity had paid for in weeks of suffering, and the precision strikes that followed were devastating in a way that the Quiet had clearly never anticipated. Because the Quiet had never been hunted before. It had always been the predator, the thing that came in silence and fed on isolation, patient and ancient and utterly confident that nothing in this young galaxy could threaten it. It was wrong. Valkyr resonance weapons hit the dimensional anchors with mathematical precision. Each strike, calibrated to within a fraction of a frequency, hit the dark entities shuddered and thinned, their formless bodies losing coherence as the anchors that held them in normal space were shattered one by one. Torvan dreadnoughts followed the resonance strikes with waves of kinetic bombardment. And this time, the rounds did not dissolve, because the Quiet was wounded now, its ability to absorb and deflect weakened by the loss of its anchors. And the tungsten slugs tore through its forms like stones through fog. The Aelith Communion deployed in patterns of breathtaking complexity, thousands of ships moving as a single mind, each maneuver designed in real time to herd the dark entities into kill zones where the Valkyr weapons could reach them. Dramari supply ships raced between the warships, refueling and rearming at speeds that should have been impossible. Their pilots flying with a precision born not from training, but from sheer desperate determination. And on the ground, humanity joined the fight. Of bunkers and basements, and the shattered remains of cities. Thousands of ragged, exhausted people who had spent 2 months fighting an enemy that ate their will to live. And they should not have had any strength left, but they did, because humans have always been unreasonably good at finding one more thing to give when everything has been taken. General Liam Morrow led them, still unable to speak above a hoarse whisper, still bearing the scars of 53 days of silence. And she organized them into squads, and sent them toward the places where the quiet's presence was strongest on the ground. The places where dark patches of formless nothing still clung to the surface of the earth, like wounds that would not heal. What happened next changed everything the galaxy understood about humanity. The Aleph had discovered that synchronized connection disrupted the quiet. But what the human ground forces demonstrated was something far more powerful. The specific electrical architecture of a brain that had evolved over millions of years to prioritize social bonding were actively toxic to the quiet at close range. Not just disruptive, toxic. When human beings stood close together and maintained emotional connections with each other, when they held hands or spoke or sang, or even simply thought about the people they loved, their brains generated a pattern of activity that the quiet could not digest, a frequency that burned it the way sunlight burns a creature of the deep ocean. Lian did not fully understand the science, but she understood the application. She sent her people forward in groups, always together, never alone, and she told them to do the one thing that came most naturally to human beings: connect. Squads of soldiers advanced through the dark zones, holding hands and talking, saying anything that came to mind, sharing stories and arguments and jokes and memories, and wherever they walked, the quiet burned. It recoiled from them like a living thing in pain, its dark, formless substance hissing and thinning and pulling away from the small, fierce knots of humanity that moved through it with voices raised and hands clasped. Some of them sang, old songs, new songs, songs they made up on the spot. It did not matter. What mattered was the act of singing together, the shared rhythm, the way human voices naturally harmonize when given the chance. And the quiet could not endure it. Some of them argued, because humans will argue about anything, anywhere, at any time. And 2 soldiers got into a heated debate about football while walking through a field of living darkness, and the darkness fled from them, because even human anger was a form of connection. Even disagreement was proof that 2 minds cared enough about each other to fight. Some of them simply held each other and wept, because 53 days of isolation had filled them with a grief so deep that it had no bottom, and the tears and the holding and the shared sorrow was itself a weapon, the most human weapon of all, the ability to be vulnerable together. The quiet broke, not all at once and not completely, but it broke, its vast dark forms fragmenting and retreating, pulling away from Earth, pulling away from the Sol system, fleeing outward toward the rim of the galaxy where the stars are thin and the silence is natural. As it fled, one of its forms paused. Every sensor in the compact fleet registered the moment, because it was the first time the quiet had ever directed a communication at anything. The message was not made of words exactly. It was a vibration, a pattern pressed into the fabric of space itself. And when the Valkyr translated it, the meaning was simple and cold, and full of something that might have been confusion. You were supposed to be alone. That was what it could not understand. It had come to silence humanity, smother the connections that made them who they were, to isolate 8 billion minds into 8 billion prisons of quiet despair. And it had expected them to break, because every other species it had encountered across 11,000 years of feeding had broken under the weight of loneliness. But humans did not break. They adapted, and they fought, and they found new ways to reach each other in the dark, ways that the quiet had never imagined, because it had never encountered a species for whom connection was not a luxury, but a biological imperative, as necessary as oxygen, as fundamental as gravity. It could not comprehend a species that would scratch words into concrete walls and tap messages on each other's hands and communicate through the colors of chemical reactions rather than accept being alone. It had underestimated them, and that mistake had cost it more than it had lost in 11,000 years of existence. The aftermath was measured in grief and gratitude in roughly equal amounts. The cost was staggering. Millions of humans had been lost during the silence, not to violence, but to despair. People who had been unable to bear the weight of total isolation and had simply faded away. And the survivors carried wounds that no medicine could reach, scars on the mind and the spirit that would take generations to heal. But they were alive. 8 billion minus the fallen, still standing, still breathing, still reaching for each other with the desperate, stubborn love that had saved them. The galaxy mourned with them. Warlord Kreth Vasur, who had never bowed to anyone in his entire life, stood before General Lean Morrow in the ruins of Geneva and placed his blade at her feet, the ancient Torvan gesture of acknowledging a warrior of equal standing. And when he spoke, his rough voice was gentler than anyone had ever heard it. "I owe my life to a human medic whose name I never learned," he said. "The rest of my days, making sure that debt is repaid." The Aelith Communion experienced something that shook their collective consciousness to its foundations. Individual grief. Each node processing the loss of human lives, not as a statistic, but as a personal wound. And the sensation was so foreign and so overwhelming that the prime node had to temporarily partition the hive mind to prevent a cascade failure. They kept the grief. They did not understand it, but they kept it because it felt important. Flock Speaker Parisha wept openly and without shame and declared humanity, flock kindred, the highest honor the Dramari had ever bestowed, an acknowledgement that humans were family in a way that transcended biology. And no non-avian species had ever received this title in the entire history of the Dramari people. Calculus Prime 9 updated the Valkyr probability models with new data, and the results were remarkable, even by Valkyr standards. Of humanity had been a useful but unremarkable species. New assessment read, "Humanity is the evolutionary counter to entropy's final expression. They are ontologically loud. Probability of galactic survival increases by 74.2% with their continued existence." Ambassador Thyra Velen, who had started all of this by noticing empty chairs in a council chamber, personally oversaw the rebuilding of every human embassy in the galaxy, and above each door she had a Rithani inscription carved in stone that translated to, "These doors shall never close again." The Galactic Compact did not dissolve when the crisis ended. It became permanent, the first true alliance of all major galactic powers, and at its center were the humans. Not because they were the strongest or the smartest or the most advanced, but because they were the ones who connected everything, the species that reached out and held on and refused to let go. Together, an early warning system designed to detect silence, to notice when voices stopped and channels went dark, to make sure that no species ever had to face the loneliness of being forgotten. And they built a memorial on Earth, in a wide-open field outside Geneva, a place where no sound-dampening technology was permitted, where visitors came from across the galaxy to simply talk and laugh and sing, where the air was always full of voices, because the people who came there understood that silence was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a warning. Years later, a young Rithani student visited the memorial and stood in the field and listened to the noise, hundreds of species mixing and mingling and filling the air with the beautiful chaotic sound of beings who had chosen to be together. She found a human guide, an older woman with silver hair and lines on her face that spoke of a suffering survived, but not forgotten. "Were you afraid?" the student asked. During the silence, the guide was quiet for a moment. Not silent, but quiet, and there was a difference. "Every second," she said, "but the thing about humans is that even when we cannot speak, even when every sound is stolen from us, even when the universe itself tries to shut us up, we find a way to reach each other. That is not bravery, that is just what we are." The Rithani student wrote those words in her journal that night. Decades later, they became the opening line of the definitive history of the Silence War, the book that every species in the galaxy would eventually read. The story of how the loudest civilization in the stars went dark, and 5 empires burned across the void to bring them back. The galaxy had always thought of humanity as noisy and intrusive and impossibly stubborn. It took an entity born from the death of stars to teach them all the truth. The noise was never a flaw. It was a feature. It was a weapon. A promise, whispered and shouted and written and signed and tapped and felt, that no matter how dark the silence became, someone somewhere would always answer. Humanity went completely silent. 5 empires responded with wrath, and the galaxy was never quiet again.